The Varan Empire sent their ultimatum on a Monday morning and it arrived in every human government inbox simultaneously at 9 in the morning Earth Standard Time, which was either a coincidence of transmission timing or a deliberate choice to make the point that the Varan had done their research on human scheduling conventions, and either way the effect was the same. Every relevant person read it at roughly the same moment. The document was 4 pages long and it was, by any professional standard, a very well-written ultimatum. The Varan had clearly put thought into it. The language was precise without being aggressive, firm without being theatrical, and structured in the way of a document written by people who had done this before and knew exactly how much clarity served their purposes and how much would tip into provocation before the other side had time to calculate their options. There were no threats of civilian casualties. No language about burning worlds or breaking species. Just a clean professional presentation of what the Varan wanted and what would happen if they did not receive it. Surrender 3 border systems. Hand over resource extraction rights to 4 mining territories. Accept permanent Varan military presence on 2 human deep space stations. Comply within 30 days. Or face invasion. The document ended with a brief appendix that was, in its own way, more carefully constructed than anything in the main text. It was a comparative military assessment. The Varan fleet numbers, their recent engagement history, their documented operational capabilities. Human defensive assets, listed accurately and without exaggeration, which was itself a message. The Varan were not inflating their numbers or minimizing humanities, because they did not need to. The honest numbers made the point on their own. 900 Varan warships with a documented track record of successful planetary occupation. Human defenses that were real and would cause real losses, but that did not change the fundamental direction of the calculation. The appendix did not say comply. It did not need to. It just showed the numbers and let the numbers speak. The Varan had done this 17 times before across 17 different civilizations and the appendix had worked every time. Diane had been an analyst in the Galactic Council's Diplomatic Observation Division for 14 years and she had watched situations like this one develop before, not this specific situation but the shape of it, the pattern of a larger power applying structured pressure to a smaller one and waiting for the math to resolve into the outcome the math always resolved into. She was sitting at her station in the observation room when the transmission log showed the ultimatum going out and she pulled up the document and read it in about 12 minutes, which was fast, but she was a fast reader of this kind of material and she had enough background on the Varan to understand each section without needing to work through it. When she finished she sat back in her chair and felt the specific quiet dread that she had felt before in these situations. Not panic. Not outrage. Just the low heavy feeling of watching something unfortunate that you could see clearly and could not stop. Tom was at the adjacent station and he had been reading simultaneously and when Diane looked over at him he had the expression of a man who had done the math quickly and had arrived somewhere he did not particularly want to be. Tom was not a quiet person by nature. 14 years of working alongside him had given Diane a detailed map of how he processed things and quiet was not usually part of his processing style. When Tom was quiet it was because he had nothing useful to add to what was already obvious and what was already obvious was uncomfortable enough that adding commentary felt like piling on. He was quiet for about 45 seconds. They will comply, he said. The math says comply. He said it without satisfaction. It was not a prediction he enjoyed making. It was the kind of thing you said out loud because saying it out loud completed the processing of it and completing the processing was how you moved on to whatever came next. Diane looked at the comparative assessment appendix on her screen. The math says comply, she agreed. Because it did. 900 warships against human defenses that were real and capable and not sufficient. That was what the math said and pretending otherwise would have been a kind of professional dishonesty that neither of them went in for. They pulled up the response timeline tracker that the observation division used to monitor diplomatic situations and set it running for the human case. 30 days was the window. The tracker would flag any formal communication from Earth to the Varan during that window and log its content and category. Diane did not expect to see anything for at least 2 weeks. Civilizations that were going to comply usually spent the first week or 10 days in internal debate about whether they had any alternatives, and the debate always eventually arrived at the same place because the math did not change during the debate, and then the compliance communication went out and the tracker flagged it and the division filed its assessment and moved on. She was reviewing a separate file 3 days later when the tracker flagged an incoming entry. She looked at the timestamp. 4 days. That was faster than usual. Civilizations that complied fast usually did so because their leadership had looked at the math quickly and had decided that the outcome of debate was not worth the cost of the time it took, and 4 days suggested a government that had looked at the math and made a decision in an unusually short time. She opened the flagged entry expecting to see a compliance communication. What she read was 4 days of complete silence followed by one sentence. "We are sending representatives." Diane read it twice. Then she reached over and tapped Tom's arm without looking up from her screen because she did not want to look away from the sentence in case she had misread it and it said something else when she looked back. Tom leaned over and read it. He sat back. They both looked at the screen. The sentence was still there. Still one sentence. Still specifically not a compliance and specifically not a counteroffer and specifically not a request for negotiation or mediation or additional time or any of the things that civilizations sent when they were trying to manage a situation they had assessed as impossible. Just a statement. "We are sending representatives." Tom looked at Diane. Diane looked at the screen. They stayed like that for a moment in the silence of two people who had 14 years of professional experience between them in exactly this kind of situation and who were now looking at a response that their 14 years of professional experience had not generated a ready category for. "Representatives?" Tom said eventually. "That is what it says," Diane said. "To do what?" Tom said. Diane looked at the sentence. "It does not say," she said. Tom looked at the Varen fleet numbers in the appendix on his own screen. 900 warships. 17 successful ultimatums. A documented operational track record that made the math very clear in a very specific direction. "The math still says comply," he said. But he said it differently than he had said it 2 days ago. Less like a conclusion and more like a question that had lost some of its certainty. Diane did not answer. She pulled up a new tracking window for the delegation and started logging what she knew, which was not much. 12 humans. Departure in 72 hours. Destination: the Varen Military Command installation where the Supreme Commander was based. 12 humans going to a Varen military installation to have a conversation that the Varen almost certainly expected to be a compliance formality dressed up as a meeting. Diane thought about the people who got sent on that kind of trip. She thought about what kind of government sent representatives instead of compliance when the math said comply. She thought about what kind of people you sent as representatives in that situation if you were not sending diplomats. She added a priority flag to the tracking window. She had a feeling she was going to want to know how this meeting went. Veth had granted the audience because refusing it would have looked like weakness, and the Varen Empire did not do things that looked like weakness. This was a considered institutional position rather than simple arrogance. The Varen had built their reputation across 17 successful ultimatums on the premise that they were the kind of power that engaged with other civilizations from a position of absolute confidence. And absolute confidence included being willing to hear the other side out before proceeding, because hearing the other side out and then proceeding anyway demonstrated the confidence more completely than refusing to engage at all. Refusing to hear them suggested you were worried about what they might say. Hearing them and proceeding showed that nothing they said changed anything. Veth had proceeded this way before. He had sat across from representatives of 3 different civilizations in this same installation and listened to their cases and thanked them for their time and watched the invasion proceed on schedule. It was not a pleasant part of the work, but it was a real part of it, and he was professional enough to do it properly. He had his protocol officer arrange the meeting room with the standard configuration for diplomatic reception. A long table. Varen delegation on one side. Human representatives on the other. Recording equipment running per standard procedure. Security positioned visibly at the exits, not as a threat but as a statement of context that he found useful to maintain during these conversations. He expected 12 diplomats. He expected the kind of people that civilizations sent when they were trying to make a last reasonable case before accepting an outcome they could not change. People with careful language and prepared arguments, and the professional bearing of individuals who understood their situation but were obligated by their role to represent their government's position with as much dignity as the situation allowed. He had dealt with that kind of delegation 3 times, and it always had a recognizable quality to it. A particular combination of composure and underlying tension that you could see if you knew how to look. The composure was real because they were professionals. The tension was real because they were in an impossible situation and they knew it. The 12 humans who came through the door did not have that quality. Veth noticed it within the first 30 seconds and spent the subsequent 4 hours trying to identify exactly what it was he had noticed and never quite arriving at a complete answer. They moved calmly. They dressed professionally. They sat down in an orderly way and arranged their materials on the table with the efficiency of people who were comfortable in meeting rooms. None of this was unusual. What was unusual was the thing underneath those surfaces that Veth could perceive without being able to name. An absence, maybe. The absence of the particular quality he was used to seeing in delegations from civilizations that were facing invasion. That underlying tension that composure sat on top of like a thin layer of ice on deep water, present if you pressed, visible at the edges if you looked for it. These 12 people did not have it. They were simply calm. Not performing calm over something else. Just calm all the way through, in the way of people for whom this room and this situation and the power dynamics it contained were not a source of the kind of pressure that produced tension. Veth filed this observation without knowing what to do with it and gave his attention to the woman who had taken the seat directly across from him. Carol introduced herself pleasantly. Her name and her title and a brief sentence about representing the human government's interests in this meeting. She said it the way you said things that were procedurally necessary but not really the substance of why you were in the room. Her voice was even and her diction was clear, and she did not use the slightly elevated register that people sometimes used in high-stakes meetings when they were managing how they came across. She just talked like a person talking. Her eyes were the thing Veth kept returning to in the subsequent days when he was trying to reconstruct the meeting clearly. They were steady in a way that was distinct from the steady eyes of a confident negotiator or a trained diplomat. Those people maintained eye contact as a deliberate communication of confidence, which meant the maintenance itself was slightly visible if you were experienced enough to see it. Carol's eyes were steady the way still water was still. Not because they were being held still. Because there was no current underneath them pushing toward movement. He found this uncomfortable in a way he could not explain to his staff. She said that her government had asked her team to come and make sure the Supreme Commander had complete information before proceeding with the planned operation. Veth nodded and gestured for her to continue because this was the expected opening and he was waiting for the expected content that would follow it, which was a case for negotiation or a presentation of human military capabilities designed to make him reconsider the math or some combination of both. Carol opened her folder. She removed one document and placed it on the table and slid it across to Veth's side with a single smooth motion. Veth looked at it. It was a list. Names, ranks, command assignments, and a column of additional notations beside each entry that he did not immediately understand the significance of. 47 entries total. He read the header. He read it again. The header identified the document as a comprehensive profile summary for the 47 Varan military commanders who would have operational involvement in the invasion of human space. Every admiral. Every fleet commander. Every ground force general who would have a role in the operation that his planning staff had spent 8 months developing in what he had been assured were fully secured channels. We have significant familiarity with all of them, Carol said. Her voice had not changed at all. Still the same even pleasant register. Their command styles and their decision patterns. She paused briefly. Their personal situations. The additional column. Veth looked at it now with different attention. Personal situations. He did not read the entries in that column because reading them in the room with Carol watching him felt like something he did not want to do without more time to prepare himself for what was in them. He kept his eyes on the header of the document and kept his expression professionally neutral because keeping his expression professionally neutral was something he had been doing for 30 years in difficult situations and he was good at it. He looked up at Carol. "Is that a threat?" he said. He asked it directly because directness was what the situation called for and because framing the document as a threat would put it in a category he knew how to respond to. Carol looked back at him. The eyes again. That quality that he could not name. "It is information," she said. The pleasantness in her voice was unchanged. Not performed pleasantness, not the diplomatic warmth that people put on like a coat in formal settings. Just her natural register, which apparently was pleasant regardless of what she was saying. "We are here to share information. That is what our government asked us to do." She reached into her folder. She had more documents. Veth looked at the stack and felt something that his 30 years of military command had not prepared him for feeling in this kind of room. He was familiar with the sensation of being outmaneuvered tactically. He had experienced it in training and occasionally in actual engagements and he knew how it felt. A specific recalibration of your assessment of the situation, a recognition that the variables were arranged differently than you had understood them to be. This was similar but different. This was the feeling of being outmaneuvered in a way he had not seen coming because the direction it came from was not a direction his experience had trained him to watch. He had invited 12 humans into his installation for a courtesy meeting before an invasion they could not prevent. He was beginning to understand that the 12 humans had a different understanding of this meeting than he did. Carol placed the second document on the table. Veth looked at it. He kept his expression neutral and his voice level and he said nothing yet because he needed a moment to look at what he was looking at and understand it before he made another sound in this room. Carol waited with those still eyes and said nothing either. She was in absolutely no hurry. The second document was a supply chain analysis. Not the kind of supply chain analysis that an external intelligence operation produced from publicly available data and educated inference, which was what Veth would have expected from even an unusually capable foreign intelligence service. Those reports had a recognizable texture, accurate at the broad level, increasingly approximate as they got closer to specific operational details, filling the gaps with probability assessments that were clearly probability assessments rather than confirmed information. This document did not have that texture. It had the texture of an internal report. The kind that Veth's own logistics staff produced for internal planning purposes, written in the specific format and with the specific categories that Varen military supply chain management used, referencing depot designations by the internal codes that existed nowhere outside the Varen's own classified logistics network. It listed specific inventory levels at specific facilities. It identified specific vessels responsible for specific supply routes. It noted specific scheduling windows and specific vulnerabilities in those schedules where a disruption to one link would cascade through the chain in ways that the logistics staff had flagged in their own internal reviews and that Veth had read in those internal reviews and that he was now reading again in a document that a human representative had just placed on the table in front of him. He read 2 pages before he looked up. Carol was watching him with the same expression she had worn since she walked in. Attentive. Pleasant. Completely untroubled by the fact that she had just put classified Varen military logistics data on the table in front of the Varen Supreme Commander. Veth looked at the document for another moment. Then he looked at the rest of the stack still in Carol's folder. Then he made the professional decision to continue the meeting because walking out or shutting it down would tell Carol something about his state of mind that he was not ready to share, and a commander who gave away information about his state of mind in a situation he did not yet understand was a commander making mistakes. Please continue, he said. Carol continued. The third document was facility locations. Not the public-facing facilities that appeared in official records, not the installations that the Varen disclosed to the Galactic Council as part of standard military transparency agreements. The other ones. The installations that existed in classified infrastructure records and that the people who worked in them knew about and that the senior command knew about and that existed nowhere else. The secondary high command facility was on the list. The installation that Veth's own staff referred to in internal communications only by a numeric designation that had no external reference. The location listed in the document was accurate to within 50 meters. Veth looked at the location. He looked at it for a moment longer than he intended to look at it. Then he moved to the next entry on the list. All of them were accurate. He did not know this for certain about every single one because there were entries on the list that fell outside his direct knowledge, but the ones he could verify against his own knowledge were accurate and the ones he could not verify directly had the same texture of specificity that accurate information had, that quality of detail that was too precise to be inference and too internally consistent to be fabricated. He kept his face neutral and his posture unchanged and he continued listening to Carol present because that was what you did when you were a 30-year military professional in a situation that was developing in an unexpected direction and you needed time to understand the direction before you responded to it. He needed more time than the meeting was giving him. The personal security arrangements were the fourth document. Veth knew the moment Carol placed it on the table what it was going to contain, not because he had seen it before but because of the sequence. Supply chains showed access to operational systems. Facility locations showed access to classified infrastructure. Personal security arrangements for the Empire's 12 most senior military figures showed something different. Something more specific and more deliberate and more carefully aimed. He read the first 3 entries. His own security arrangements were entry 2. The document described his residential security in accurate detail, the shift rotation his protection staff used, the specific protocols for his transit between the installation and his quarters, the identification codes used in his personal protection network that only the people in that network and the senior command who authorized it were supposed to know. He read this without changing his expression because changing his expression was not something he was going to do in this room. He placed the document face down on the table. He stood. "Excuse me for a moment," he said. Carol nodded pleasantly. Veth walked out of the room with Gary beside him and the door closed behind them and they stood in the corridor and Gary looked like someone who had been doing security work for 20 years and had just discovered that the 20 years had not prepared him for this specific situation. "How do they have this?" Veth said. He kept his voice level and quiet because the corridor had other people in it further down and he was not ready for this conversation to be anything other than private. Gary was quiet for a moment that was not the pause of someone thinking of an answer but the pause of someone accepting that the answer they had arrived at was the only available one even though it was not a comfortable one. "I don't know," Gary said. His voice had the careful flatness of a professional managing something that was pressing against his professional composure from the inside. Some of what is in those documents does not exist in any system that could have been accessed from outside this installation or from outside the secure networks connected to it. He paused. It exists in physical records in secured facilities and in the memories of the specific people who were involved in making those decisions. Veth looked at the closed door of the meeting room. Through the narrow window beside the door he could see the human delegation still seated at the table. Carol was saying something to one of her colleagues, quietly, and the colleague was nodding, and neither of them appeared to be doing anything other than waiting comfortably for the meeting to resume. None of them were checking personal devices or conferring urgently or doing anything that looked like people who were managing a high-pressure operation from inside a hostile military installation. They looked like people who were waiting for a meeting to continue. People who were entirely comfortable waiting. "Who did we invite into this building?" Veth said. He said it quietly and without any particular inflection because it was not a question he expected Gary to answer. It was the question he was asking himself and saying out loud because sometimes saying a thing out loud was the first step toward understanding it. Gary said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Veth looked through the window for another moment. 12 humans. Sitting calmly at a table in the middle of a barren military installation with classified documents they should not have possessed. Showing no concern about being in that situation. Showing no concern about anything. He thought about the security arrangements document. His own shift rotations. His own identification codes. He thought about how you got that information. What it required. What kind of access and what kind of patience and what kind of operational capability it implied if you had it. He thought about the fact that Carol had placed it on the table calmly and pleasantly and described it as information and said they were there to share information and had then waited for him to read it with the unhurried ease of someone who had all the time available and no particular anxiety about what happened next. He understood something in that moment that he had not understood when he walked out of the room. He understood that the documents were not the point. The documents were the demonstration. What the documents pointed toward, what they implied about the kind of operation that had produced them and the kind of people who ran that operation, was the actual information being shared. Carol had said so herself in the first 5 minutes. We are here to share information. She had been completely accurate. She had just not specified which information was the important part. We are going back in, Veth said. Gary opened the door. Carol looked up when they entered and smiled the same pleasant smile she had been wearing since she arrived and said thank you for your patience and opened her folder and placed the next document on the table. Veth sat down and looked at it and noted that his hands were completely still on the table in front of him and that this required no effort at all, because 30 years of military command had built that stillness into him at a level below conscious control. He was grateful for that right now. Because the next document was worse than the previous ones. Carol began presenting it in the same even voice she had been using for 2 hours. Methodically. Calmly. No visible emotion anywhere on the human side of the table. Veth requested the intelligence the same evening the meeting ended. He did not wait until the next morning because waiting until the next morning was not something he was capable of after 4 hours in that room. He had sat through the full meeting with his professional composure intact and he had thanked Carol and her team at the end and he had walked them to the installation exit himself, which was a courtesy he extended to demonstrate that nothing in the previous 4 hours had changed his fundamental position. He had shaken Carol's hand and she had smiled pleasantly and said it had been a productive meeting and he had agreed that it had been, and then he had watched the human delegation transport leave the installation and gone directly to his office and called Paul. Paul ran the intelligence division and had done so for 11 years and Veth trusted his work in the specific complete way you trusted people who had proven themselves in that role over a long period of time. He told Paul what he needed. Full profiles on all 12 humans. Everything available. Backgrounds, service records, psychological assessments wherever they could be accessed. Anything in any database that the intelligence division could reach. Paul said 48 hours. Veth said make it faster if possible. Paul said he would try and Veth could tell from his voice that Paul had heard something in Veth's request that was different from the normal urgency of a routine intelligence task. Paul was good at hearing things in voices. It was part of what made him effective in his role. Veth spent the next 48 hours doing his regular work and doing it thoroughly because regular work done thoroughly was how you kept your mind from running ahead of the information it did not yet have. He attended his scheduled briefings. He reviewed operational planning documents. He had 3 meals at regular times and slept adequately if not completely. He did not look at the documents Carol had left behind. He had instructed his staff to secure them pending the intelligence report and he had not looked at them since the meeting ended because he did not want to sit alone with those documents and his own incomplete understanding of what they represented. He would look at them again when Paul's report gave him a framework for understanding them properly. Paul called on the morning of the second day and asked for an in-person meeting. Veth had been waiting for a written report filed through the standard intelligence channel. That was how Paul operated. He was a thorough writer who preferred the precision of written communication for significant intelligence findings because written reports could be reviewed carefully and referenced later and did not depend on the completeness of anyone's memory of a conversation. 11 years and Paul had always filed written reports. He was asking for an in-person meeting. Veth told him to come immediately and Paul was in his office within 20 minutes, which meant Paul had been on his way before Veth said come, which meant Paul had made the decision to deliver this in person before he made the call to ask permission, which told Veth something about the content before Paul opened his folder. Paul sat down across from the desk. He put the folder in front of him but did not open it immediately. He looked at Veth for a moment in the way of someone deciding on the order in which to present something, which for Paul was unusual because Paul typically had his presentation sequence decided before he walked into a room. The 12 humans, Paul said. He said it as an opening that established the subject without yet making a claim about it. We ran full profiles on all of them. Backgrounds going back to their early records. Service histories. Psychological assessments where we could access the source documents and assessments we constructed ourselves where we could not. And, Veth said. Paul looked at his folder. The pause before he answered was about 3 seconds, which for Paul was a long pause. Paul was a precise and efficient communicator who did not use pauses for effect. When Paul paused, it was because he was choosing between two ways of saying something and the choice required a moment. They are not diplomats, he said. That assessment you made in the meeting was correct and the profile data supports it fully. He paused again, shorter this time. They are also not intelligence officers in any conventional sense. The training signatures are different. The operational history is different. The selection criteria are different. Different how? Veth said. Paul opened the folder. He did not take anything out of it yet. He looked at the top page and then looked at Veth. Earth has a division, he said. It does not appear in any public record and its existence is not discussed in any intercivilization diplomatic context that our intelligence has access to. We found references to it through indirect methods. Personnel records that showed career gaps with no external explanation. Budget allocations that moved into categories with no public description, training facility records that noted specific individuals without noting what the training was for. He paused. It handles situations. What situations? Veth said. Situations like this one, Paul said. Specifically situations like this one. Where a significantly larger force is applying structured pressure to human interests and where the standard response options, conventional military engagement or conventional diplomatic resolution, have both been assessed as insufficient or suboptimal. He took the first page out of the folder and placed it on the desk facing Veth. The division selects for specific qualities. Veth looked at the page. It was a profile summary. Not Carol specifically. A composite description of the selection criteria, assembled from the indirect sources Paul had mentioned, with supporting references cited in small text at the bottom of the page. Exceptional cognitive capacity across multiple domains. Exceptional patience of a specific kind, not the patience of someone waiting for something to end, but the patience of someone for whom extended difficult situations were simply not experienced as difficult in the way most people experience them. And a third quality that the profile described in clinical language that Veth read twice before he fully absorbed what it was saying. A psychological profile that placed them genuinely outside the normal range of response to high-pressure threatening situations. Not trained resistance to those responses. Not professional suppression of those responses. The responses themselves were simply not present in the way they were present in most people. Veth thought about Carol's eyes. That quality he had spent 2 days trying to name. He had not been able to name it because he had been looking for something that was there. A trained quality. A controlled quality. Something being maintained. What he had been looking at was an absence. The absence of the responses that the situation should have produced. Carol, he said. 15 years in the division, Paul said. He took a second page from the folder. She was recruited at 25. The profile assessments from her recruitment indicate that the qualities I described were already fully present at that point rather than developed through training. The training refined how those qualities were applied. It did not create them. He placed the second page on the desk. The youngest member of her delegation has been in the division for 6 years. He was recruited at 22. Veth looked at the second page. Then he looked at Paul. They came here to show me what they know, Veth said. He said it slowly because he was working it out as he spoke. The documents. The information. All of it presented calmly across 4 hours. He paused. They came to show me what they know. Yes, Paul said. But they did not show me what they do with what they know, Veth said. Paul looked at him steadily. No, he said. They did not. The room was quiet. Veth sat with the 2 pages on the desk in front of him and thought about the meeting. 4 hours. 12 people on the other side of the table presenting impossible information in a calm, pleasant voice without any of the indicators that should have accompanied that situation. No tension beneath the composure. No current beneath the still water. People for whom extended difficult situations were not experienced as difficult. People selected specifically for situations where conventional responses were insufficient. People who had come to a Varen military installation and sat across from the Varen Supreme Commander and shown him what they knew, and had not shown him what they did with it. What do they do with it? Veth said. The information. When showing it is not sufficient. When the situation requires something beyond the demonstration. He looked at Paul. What does the division do? Paul had been in intelligence work for a long time. He had delivered difficult information to difficult people in difficult situations, and he had learned over those years to deliver it clearly and completely, because the alternative, softening it or hedging it or leaving the receiver to fill in the gaps themselves, produced worse outcomes than the discomfort of the direct delivery. He looked at Veth steadily. Whatever is necessary, Paul said. That is the division's operational mandate, and that is specifically why the selection criteria are what they are. He closed the folder. The psychological profile they select for is not incidental to the work. It is the requirement for the work. You need people who can do whatever the situation requires and who experience the doing of it in a way that allows them to continue functioning effectively afterward. The room stayed quiet. Veth looked at the folder on Paul's side of the desk. He thought about Carol sitting in the meeting room after he and Gary had stepped out. The quiet conversation with her colleague. The complete absence of any visible concern about being 12 humans in the middle of a Varen military installation with classified documents on the table. He understood now what he had been looking at. He had been looking at people who had considered every possible direction this situation could develop and had made their peace with all of those directions before they walked in the door, because making peace with all the directions in advance was what the work required, and they had been selected specifically because they could do that. 12 people who were comfortable with whatever came next. Because whatever came next was something they were prepared for. Something they had been selected and trained and sent here specifically to handle. Veth sat with that understanding for a long moment. Then he thanked Paul and told him to leave the folder, and Paul left, and Veth sat alone in his office with the profile pages on his desk and thought about the invasion timeline his planning staff had spent 8 months developing, and thought about 30 days, and thought about 12 humans who had sat in his building and shown him what they knew and not shown him what they did with it. He sat with that for a long time. The withdrawal notice arrived on a Thursday morning, and it arrived quietly. Not with the kind of announcement that significant diplomatic developments sometimes arrived with, not with the advanced signals from multiple sources that usually preceded major shifts in intercivilization political situations. Just a standard communication through official Varen diplomatic channels, routed to the Galactic Council's incoming correspondence system, filed under the standard category for diplomatic position updates, sitting in the queue between a trade dispute notification from the Prelian system and a routine boundary clarification from a small outer civilization that nobody had been paying particular attention to. Diane found it because she checked the queue every morning as the first task of her day, a habit built over 14 years that she maintained even on mornings when she did not expect anything significant, because the mornings you did not expect anything significant were occasionally the mornings when something significant was sitting in the queue waiting for you. She opened the Varen communication and read it. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph referenced the ultimatum issued to humanity on the previous date and noted that the Varen Empire was formally withdrawing that ultimatum effective immediately. The second paragraph cited a reassessment of strategic priorities in light of evolving considerations in multiple operational theaters and noted that the Empire's current focus would be redirected accordingly. The third paragraph expressed the Empire's continued interest in productive diplomatic engagement with the galactic community and noted the Empire's ongoing commitment to the principles of intercivilization discourse. 3 paragraphs. Formal language. No specifics about what the reassessment had involved or what the evolving considerations were or which operational theaters were now receiving the redirected focus. Diane read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at it on her screen for a moment longer, not because she had missed anything on the first 2 reads but because some things needed a moment of looking at before they became fully real. Tom came in 20 minutes later carrying coffee and his usual morning energy, and he stopped when he saw Diane's face and looked at her screen and read the notice standing up behind her chair. He read it once. He was a fast reader and the notice was not long. He said nothing for a moment. "They backed down?" he said. He said it with the specific quality of someone confirming something they had not expected to be confirming. Not disbelief exactly. More the sound of a conclusion arriving that your analytical framework had not predicted and that you were now integrating into the framework through the simple act of saying it out loud. "The math said they shouldn't back down," he said. "They got different math," Diane said. Tom came around the side of her station and sat in the adjacent chair and looked at the notice properly now. 3 paragraphs. Formal language. The specific kind of diplomatic phrasing that was designed to convey a position change without specifying the reason for the change, which was what you used when the reason was not something you wanted in any official record. "From 12 people in a meeting room," Tom said. He said it the way you said something when the saying of it was the process of understanding it, working through the gap between what you knew had happened and what your existing framework could explain about why it had happened. "From 12 people who came specifically prepared to share information that should have been impossible to have," Diane said. "Who sat in that room for 4 hours and shared it calmly and then left." She looked at the notice on her screen. The Varen spent 11 days with what those 12 people left behind. 11 days thinking about what the information meant. About what it implied about the people who had it. About what came next if they proceeded with the invasion on schedule. She paused. "And then they made a decision," she said. Tom looked at the notice. 11 days, he said. "From the meeting to the withdrawal. 11 days to sit with a specific set of questions," Diane said. "Questions that the meeting was designed to put in front of them. What kind of operation produces that information? What kind of people run that operation? What those people do in situations that are not resolved by showing what they know." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that Diane had been sitting with since she first read the notice. "What did come next?" he said. "If they hadn't backed down. If the Varen had looked at everything Carol left on that table and decided to proceed anyway." He was not asking it as a strategic analysis question. He was asking it the way you asked questions when you were genuinely uncertain whether you wanted the answer. What does that division do? When showing what they know isn't enough. Diane had reviewed the meeting footage twice. The observation division had access to the recording through a council monitoring arrangement that the Varen installation operated under as part of standard diplomatic transparency protocols, and Diane had pulled the footage the day after the meeting and watched it all the way through and then watched specific sections again. The 4 hours of Carol and her colleagues presenting documents. The moment when Veth stepped out with his security chief. Carol's quiet conversation with her colleague while they waited. Veth coming back in. Carol smiling and continuing. She had watched Carol's face for those 4 hours. The pleasant expression that did not vary. The steady eyes that she had read about in the observation notes her colleagues had filed and that she could now see for herself in the footage and that were, in person on a screen, exactly as difficult to fully characterize as the notes had suggested. Still in the specific way that still water was still. Not held still. Just still. She had watched Carol place document after document on the table in front of the supreme commander of a 900-ship empire, in a military installation surrounded by Varen security, in a situation that had no favorable conventional outcome for the human side, and Carol had done all of this with the complete ease of someone who had fully accounted for every direction the situation could develop and was comfortable with all of them. Comfortable with all of them. Diane had thought about that phrase for 11 days while the Varen were thinking about their own version of the same question. "I don't think we want to know," Diane said. She said it honestly, not as a deflection but as a genuine answer to a genuine question. She had thought about it enough to have a position on it. "I think that is specifically the point," she said. "The division exists in the space between what is shown and what is done." Carol showed Veth what they know. She did not show him what they do with it. And the not showing was as deliberate as the showing. She looked at the footage still paused on her secondary screen, Carol's face in the moment before Veth stepped out. The most effective version of that kind of operation is the one where the other side makes their decision based on the demonstration alone. Based on the implication. Based on 11 days of sitting in a room with the question of what comes next and arriving at the conclusion that they do not want to find out. Tom looked at his coffee. "Earth sent 12 people," he said. "Against 900 warships." "Earth sent the right 12 people," Diane said. "That is a completely different thing than just sending 12 people." She closed the footage window and closed the meeting file and closed the analysis documents she had been building for 11 days and opened the withdrawal notice one more time and began writing her official assessment of the situation for the Council's diplomatic record. She wrote it carefully because it was going to be part of the permanent record and she wanted the permanent record to say the accurate thing rather than the simple thing, which were related but not identical. She wrote that the Varan Empire had withdrawn an ultimatum against humanity 11 days after a human delegation had delivered information to the Varan Supreme Commander at his primary installation. She wrote that the nature of the information and the manner of its delivery had prompted a reassessment of the Varan's strategic position. She wrote that the reassessment had produced the withdrawal. She stopped before the next sentence and thought about how to write it. Then she wrote that the withdrawal represented not a military victory or a diplomatic negotiation but a third thing, a category that the Council's assessment frameworks did not have a clean label for, which was the outcome produced when one party demonstrated to another party with sufficient clarity that the calculation they believed they were making was not the calculation they were actually making. The Varan had believed they were calculating the viability of invading a civilization with respectable but insufficient defenses. 12 humans had come to their installation and demonstrated that the calculation also included variables the Varan had not accounted for, could not fully quantify, and had 11 days to decide whether they wanted to discover the value of through direct experience. They had decided they did not. Diane filed the assessment and leaned back in her chair. Tom was still sitting beside her, looking at his coffee, processing in the quiet way he processed things when the processing required more than talking through it. The Varan are not a small empire, he said eventually. 900 warships. 17 successful ultimatums. A 30-year track record of exactly this kind of expansion. No, Diane said. They are not a small empire. And 12 humans changed their calculation. 12 specific humans, Diane said. Selected for specific reasons. Prepared in specific ways. Sent because the people who sent them understood exactly what the situation required and had spent a long time building the capability to provide it. She looked at the closed file on her screen. Earth did not send 12 people. Earth sent the answer to the question the Varan were asking, in the form of 12 people who were themselves the demonstration of what the answer contained. Tom thought about that. Outside the observation room window the galactic community went about its business, unaware in most of its daily functioning of the 11 days that had just passed and the 3-paragraph notice that had ended them and the 12 humans who had sat calmly in a military installation and changed the direction of something large by showing one carefully selected portion of what they knew. In the months that followed the Varan Empire quietly reassessed several other planned operations across their expansion zones. The reassessments were conducted internally and the conclusions were not shared with any external party. The diplomatic observers noted the pattern and filed their analyses and could not identify a specific cause for the pattern beyond the general observation that the Empire's strategic priorities appeared to have shifted in a consistent direction across multiple theaters simultaneously. The consistent direction was away from anything involving human space. Not because the math had changed. Because 11 days in a room with the right question had produced an answer that 900 warships and 17 successful ultimatums had not previously required the Varan to consider. The answer was simple. Some calculations had variables you could not see until someone came and showed them to you. And some of those variables, once seen, changed everything about what the calculation was actually for.